1 Corinthians. It's easy to find. You go to the New Testament, start with Matthew, you go east or west, whichever way you'll look at it, go about 6 or 7 books, you're in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Now here is what's surprising. This little book called Corinthians is a very fascinating book. It's like a Christian soap opera. This was one weird church. I mean, it was just weird. But what's really interesting is that Paul chose to write to this church in this city about this topic, because Corinth, I've been to Corinth many times. I've been to the ancient ruins there. It's a fascinating place to go. Corinth would have fit perfectly in our culture today. It was Atlanta, it was New York, it was LA, it was very secular, it was very pagan. As a matter of fact, there's a hieroglyphic, you can see it when you go there. It says, what happens in Corinth stays in Corinth, okay? It was that kind of a city. There was a party going on in Corinth 24 hours a day. They worshiped all these pagan gods, but their favorite goddess was Aphrodite, who, as you know, is the goddess of sex. Now, you go there and you will find they had temples that were dedicated just to Aphrodite. As a matter of fact, their coinage, on their coins, we have people, presidents and people like that. Their coinage, every coin had the picture of Aphrodite, the goddess of sex. They literally worshiped sex. Sex was their number one god. They had 3 temples, big, huge temples, that were dedicated to the worship of Aphrodite. Now, they had, in some of those temples, they would have up to 1,000 prostitutes that were there to help you to worship this goddess. So you can imagine, every Sunday for men was high attendance day in Corinth, okay? So you've got all this going on, and then it's compounded by the fact that they were teaching and they were kind of propagating this idea that sex within marriage was only for having children. That the best sex and the greatest sex was not for taking place within marriage, it was really outside of marriage. Well, I say again, not a lot's changed. Go to the movies, turn on your TV, and here's what you'll find, that most often that sex in the movies and sex on TV is usually spontaneous, it's very passionate, it's usually short, it's quick, it's intense, and usually the only qualification for the vast majority of time is either the couple's just first met, or they're not married to each other, or they're not married to anybody at all. So they're either in a non-marital affair or they are in an extramarital affair. And passionate marital sex is just rarely depicted on the screen. And as a matter of fact, I was reading the other day, back when Blockbuster was in business and people were renting movies, some people did a study, and they studied the top movies that people rented that had any kind of a romantic theme in it at all. Here's what they found. Now, this is kind of fascinating to me. They looked at all these movies and they found that any sexual behavior that took place in the movies that people rented, it only happened 15% of the time between married couples. 85% of the time, it was between people who were not even married. And the predominant narrative was, once you get married, sexual chemistry kind of fizzles out. I mean, the fire kind of goes out. Well, the problem with that is the scientific clinical reality is just the opposite. Because we now know, sociologists will tell you this, married couples have more sex and more satisfying sex, at least in marriages that are truly healthy, than people who don't. Scientists even say now, they've discovered, I don't know how they come up with these figures, but sex within marriage plays a 20% role in helping you to have a healthy, positive marriage. 42% of wives said they found sex emotionally and physically satisfying, compared to just 31% of single women who had a non-married sex partner. On the other hand, 48% of husbands said sex was satisfying emotionally, compared to just 37% of cohabiting men. Now, that all sounds good, but here's the really bad news. Dr. Andrew Atwood, who is a marriage and family expert, he estimates, and this is conservative, he says there are probably at least 17 million married couples in America where sex is non-existent. They have just no physical relation whatsoever. And that brings us to the Apostle Paul, who's dealing exactly with this problem in the church at Corinth. As a matter of fact, part of the letter that he wrote was a response to some questions they had written him in a prior letter he had written to them. So he begins by saying this in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 1. He said, "Now, for the matters that you wrote about." So in other words, what he's saying is, I'm really responding to what you wrote me about. Now, and here's what you have to understand. You say, well, why were they writing Paul? Paul was kind of the Dr. Phil for this church. And the reason was he founded the church. He started the church. He had won many of these people to Christ. He had seen many of these people baptized. So they kind of looked at, he was kind of their spiritual father, head figure, if you will. And so what they had written to him was this. Here's a question they had written to him. It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. They weren't talking about outside of marriage. They were talking about inside of marriage. And evidently what happened was they had come to this belief some way, somehow, that when a man and a woman get married, that the only time they should ever have sex is if they wanted to have a child. Otherwise, they should abstain. So Paul says, okay, I need to set the record straight. You got this all wrong about the role of sex and the married life. Now, let me just warn you. What he says was an eye-opener then, just like it's going to be somewhat an eye-opener now. I read the other day about a man that went to the zoo, and he was looking at all the different animals, and he came to this big cage, and it had a sign over it, and all it said was monkeys. But there were no monkeys in the cage, and he was wondering, why aren't there monkeys in the cage? So about that time, a guy walked by, and he had a uniform on. He said, excuse me, do you work here? And he said, well, yeah, as a matter of fact, he said, I'm the zookeeper. He said, well, I got a question. He said, you got a sign here that says monkeys, and there's no monkeys in the cage. And the guy kind of blushed a little bit, and he said, well, he said, to be honest with you, he said, it's mating season, and they're all inside. And the guy looked at him, and he said, do you think they'd come out for peanuts? And the guy looked at him, and he said, would you? Now, maybe the problem is somebody out there is eating too many peanuts. I don't know what the problem is, okay? What I do want to do is I just want to share with you sex and marriage from a biblical perspective, from what a man by the name of Paul wrote to these folks in Corinth. And he says there are three things that make sex so important in the role of marriage. They all come not from my mind, they come from the heart of God. You ready? Number one, we consummate marriage through the sexual act. That's how you consummate marriage. We consummate marriage through the sexual act. Now, Paul, remember, he's answering a question. Okay, you guys are asking me, should a man and a wife abstain from sex in marriage except when they want to have a child, when they want to procreate a child? So here's his answer. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife and each woman with her own husband. Now, again, it encourages me to even see they had the same problem with sexual immorality back then that we have 2,000 years later. It's not a recent phenomenon. Sexual immorality is as old as the beginning of time. In fact, it was a particular problem in this city 2,000 years ago. And this is why this is so important to me. I don't know of anything I've ever seen in all my years as a pastor. I don't know of anything that's more of a burden when it's done wrong and more of a blessing when it's done right than the act of sex, because I've seen it with my eyes. Sexual sin is a napalm bomb to so many people and so many relationships. It's broken more marriages, shattered more homes, shed more tears, caused more hurt, killed more friendships, destroyed more families, hindered more children than almost anything else you can imagine. And it may be why the Bible doesn't pull any punches about this subject, and the Bible is very plain, and the Bible is very candid about the when of sex and the where of sex and the who of sex. So just as a reminder, Sex 101, sex was never intended for a man and a man. It was never intended for a woman and a woman. It was never intended for just a man and a woman. Sex was always intended from the beginning for a husband and a wife. When my boys were growing up, and we had the quote-unquote talk, I would say to them something like this: sex is like a train. When it stays within the tracks, it'll get you where you want to go every single time. But if it jumps the tracks, You're going to wind up in a place you didn't want to be, and somebody's going to get hurt, and something is going to get destroyed. So the train of sex was always meant to run between the tracks of marriage, between a husband and a wife. Because once again, I've told you this many times, we complicate the simple. Jesus simplifies the complicated. It works that way every single time, because Paul gives us a very simple formula. It's fail-safe, it's foolproof. It works every time. You know why it works every time? Because it's God's way of doing it, okay? Here's the plan. This is God's plan. Virginity before marriage, monogamy after marriage. All right, can you just say that with me out loud? Virginity before marriage, monogamy after marriage. Now look, I get it. Roll your eyes. It's the 21st century. You got to be kidding me. You can't really be realistic. Let me tell you something. If you don't learn anything else about Hollywood, you better wake up and smell the roses. Hollywood's teaching us all the time, this is the way to do it. Hollywood's way doesn't work. They put on this big facade. You've got so many broken relationships. You've got so many, and I'm not down necessarily on Hollywood. I'm just telling you the truth. God knew what he was doing because he invented it. He created it. He's the guy that knows more about it than anybody else. He says, this is the way it works. Virginity before marriage and monogamy after marriage. In other words, no sex before marriage, all sex within marriage, no sex without marriage. However, Paul is addressing an even deeper problem. He says, good grief, you guys are married, husband married to wives, wives married to husbands, and you don't understand. Part of the purpose of marriage is to enjoy the pleasures of sex. Because somehow, and you may remember what we call the Victorian era, somehow we came up with this idea that, sex was dirty, sex was unclean, sex is something that, you should only do at certain times and certain places for a certain purpose, and there's no way you should ever enjoy just the pleasure of something God has given. As a matter of fact, a leading marital therapist and a Christian psychologist, he's an expert, I'm not, I want you to listen to what he said. He said, sexual pleasure is one of the most intense human experiences. Physically speaking, when a man or woman reaches sexual excitement, nerve endings release a chemical into the brain called, I thought this was fascinating, opioid. I thought that was kind of interesting, okay? Opioid means opium-like and is a good description of the power of this chemical. Apart from a heroin-induced experience, nothing is more physically pleasurable than sex. This is a wonderful thing in a committed marriage relationship because it helps to bond two people together and bring joy to living together and building a relationship. And that's the very purpose of a honeymoon. And I can tell you, and those of you who have been married, been on a honeymoon, you know this. He's exactly right. I've never told this before, and Teresa's going to blush, but I'll tell it anyway. We were on our honeymoon, and I was carrying her across the threshold. And we had saved ourselves, and so I carried across the threshold, and I put her down, and I looked up, and I said, Lord Jesus, I do believe you're coming again. But please, not tonight, okay? So, and let me tell you something I bet you've never thought about before. I bet you've never thought about this. I cannot explain it. I can't put it into words, but you know what I'm about to tell you is absolutely true. We'd only known each other for 6 months. We got married. We consummated our marriage that night in our first night together. We woke up the next morning, and it was so real to me. We were one. We were one. I can't put it into words, but she wasn't just someone I dated. She wasn't just someone that I knew. She wasn't just someone that I quote unquote had sex with. We were one. There was a new bond there that only God could create, doing it the way he meant to do it. So first of all, we consummate marriage through the sexual act. Then Paul says something else. He says we celebrate marriage with sexual passion. We celebrate marriage with sexual passion. Now, I'm going to tell you something you already know, right? The husband has his needs, and the wife has her needs, and those needs are to be continuously met. So here's what Paul's about to tell us. The fire that is lit on the honeymoon night is never to go out. I don't know where we get that idea. He said it's never to go out. It's never, just because the honeymoon is over doesn't mean that you put a damper on the fire. That's why Paul goes on to say this. He says the husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. Now, let me just say something now. All you husbands, listen up. Oh, well, by the way, no elbows. I'll kick you out of here if you start elbowing. No elbows. In the first 2 verses, Paul has dealt with the premarital life. Now he's dealing with the postmarital life. And here's what he's saying. He said, okay, once you get married, the love that you express through sexual intimacy is something you should give to each other and you owe each other. Now, husbands, listen up. Now, listen carefully. It is not coincidental that he starts here with the husband first. He could have started with the wife first. He had a reason for doing it, I think. He was a great psychologist. He said, husband, you have a marital duty that you owe to your wife. Now, I don't think it's, again, coincidental that he started with the husbands. What he's saying is, hey, guys, we go first. We are to give to our wives the same physical affection and the same attention after marriage that we gave to our wives before marriage. You need to continuously tell her and show her and affirm to her that you love her like you don't love anybody else. And you need to do it in ways that they can hear it and they can see it and they can experience it. Because I realize, yeah, it takes 2 to keep a fire going. I get that, guys. Hear me. But it only takes 1 to get it started.
It's been a great sermon so far, and Dr. Merritt's final points are coming up. Before we return to the message, I'd like to share with you a little bit about who we are. Touching Lives exists to touch the lives of the lost and enrich the faith of the found. And we accomplish these goals by the grace of God and through the generosity of people just like you. I'd like to invite you to partner with us financially because together we can continue reaching people all over the world for Jesus. Donating is safe and easy. Go to our website at touchinglives.org and look for the donate button near the top of the homepage. If you enroll as a recurring monthly donor with a monthly gift of $50 or more, we have a very special gift for you, an official Touching Lives partner coin that we hope will remind you to pray for the lost each time you see it. No matter if you're able to give or not, please pray for us as we minister to people all over the world. Your prayers are worth more money than you could ever send. And now let's get back to Dr. Merritt's sermon.
And I believe what Paul is saying is, God has given to the husband the primary responsibility of keeping the romantic fire burning. Courtship does not end when the marriage begins. Matter of fact, let me just tell you this. When the marriage begins, that's when real courtship begins. When marriage begins, that's when real courtship begins. No married couple should ever quit dating. I mean, go back. All you guys in here that you know, you dated your wife, right? So go back to the time when you were dating. You'd go out and you know, you'd take her to a nice movie, maybe take her to dinner or whatever. How many times would you walk her to the door and you'd have to stop at the door and just give her a goodnight kiss when you really wanted to go in and have some fun? Well, now you get to do both. That's the joy of being married. But now watch this, ladies, because again, he's a great psychologist. So he starts off, he says, okay, husbands first. But then in verse 4, he reverses it. Now he talks to the wife first. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body. He yields it to his wife. Now, I want to be very delicate, and I don't want to be misunderstood. And yes, I already hear me too. I got it, okay? I'm not tone deaf here. So I want to make this statement, and this, ladies and you men need to hear about this next statement. Very important. Even in marriage, it is never right for a man to force himself on his wife. Even in marriage. When a wife says no and means no, the answer is no. Now you guys, everybody hear that? Raise your hand if you heard that. I don't want any emails, phone calls, letters. Don't call the cops on me, okay? I don't want to be on 60 Minutes tomorrow, okay? When a woman says no, even in marriage, no is no. And there are times when a woman has a legitimate reason for saying no. I get it, okay? The flip side, ladies, is this. Paul is saying, wives, however, you do have a biblical and marital responsibility to meet your husband's needs when you are able to do so. So he says, husbands, you've got the biblical responsibility to meet the sexual needs of your wife. And wife, you've got the biblical responsibility to meet the physical needs of your husband. So when either partner requests intimacy, unless again, there's a strong physical or emotional or spiritual reason why that intimacy should be withheld, he said sexual love and affection should be given. This is why Paul goes on to say this in verse 5. Do not deprive each other except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Paul says, look, I get it. There will be times, for whatever the reason, that a husband and wife may say, we're going to abstain for a while. We're not going to make love for a while. We're not going to do this for a while. It could be you want to give attention to spiritual matters. Look, it could be because you're under a lot of stress at work. It could be a lot of things going on with the kids. I mean, I get all that. He says that's okay. But what Paul goes on to say, but don't claim a headache every night. Ladies, that's not right. Men, that's not right. I got to tell you this. I heard about a husband. He's been on a long business. Been gone about 3 weeks. Comes home. He's in a super romantic mood. But he wants to do everything he can to kind of set the table and so he could have some downtime and with his wife and some together time. And he realizes it's his job to kind of, light the fire. And so he comes in. He cooks a beautiful meal for his wife. He washes the dishes. He turns the bed down. He gets the kids in bed and he takes a shower. He gets out of the shower and he walks out, and his wife, she's already in the bed. So he comes out of the bathroom and he's got a glass of water and 2 aspirin. And he brings it over to his wife. And she says, what is that? He said, well, it's a glass of water and 2 aspirin. She said, I don't have a headache. He said, gotcha. Now, we ought to celebrate marriage through sexual passion, all right? Here's the last thing. We consecrate marriage in sexual expression. Now this really is good. Just hang with me. We consecrate marriage in sexual expression. Now I want you to notice how Paul concludes his advice. Okay, it's really, really good stuff. Now to the unmarried and the widows. You're single, you've never been married, or you've been married and your spouse died. I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I do. Okay? And it is. Teresa says to me sometimes, I'll say to her, honey, I've told her, I said, anything ever happens to me, you feel free to remarry. It won't bother me, I won't care, it'll be great. You know what she always says to me? Nah, one's enough. Okay, so he said, look, it's maybe good that you don't get married, that's okay. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it's better to marry than to burn with passion. So Paul says, look, there is a place for this sexual passion we're all born with. There's a place to let it burn hot. There's a place to let it burn bright. And that is in the marital relationship. But here's what he's telling us. Sex is not just for procreation, to have kids. Sex is not even just for recreation, just to have the pleasure of having sex. Sex is for communication. It is one of the ways that we are able to tell our spouses just how much we really love them and love them exclusively. If you go back to the Old Testament, you ought to read the Old Testament. The Old Testament is a great part. Sometimes Old Testament gets a bad rap, but the Old Testament is great. There's some fantastic stories in the Old Testament. And one of the things you'll learn is when the Bible begins to talk about, the Old Testament begins to talk about men and women having sexual relations, it uses a phrase. It will say this, so-and-so knew his wife. Kind of a interesting way to put it, right? So-and-so knew his wife. Now, they didn't mean by that they shake hands and say, how you doing? My name's James, right? He's talking about having, when you come together in that sexual relationship. That's what he's talking about. But he uses that phrase, you come to know your husband or you come to know your wife. And what they meant by that was when a husband and wife come together in that physical union, they experience the most intimate form of communication that 2 human beings can have. And they're not just communicating physical, sexual passion. They're communicating personal, spiritual love. And what Hollywood says is, no, you can divorce the physical from the emotional. I want to have sex, but let's don't get involved. See how that works out for you. No, you can divorce the sexual from the spiritual. You don't need God to have sex. True, you don't need God to have sex. But sex will never mean what it should mean. And it will never do what it should do if you don't put God in the picture. And that's what Paul is trying to tell us. So Paul's saying, look, it's better to marry than to burn. Okay, I want to make that plain. Don't just, be on, but he says, look, I am not saying, this is what some people misunderstand Paul. I'm not saying, well, boy, if you just can't control yourself, go find somebody and marry her. That's not what he's saying. Or if you just can't control yourself, go find somebody and marry him. He's not being negative, he's being positive. What he means when he says when burning with passion, he's not just talking about the fire that's in your hormones. He's talking about the fire that's in your heart. What he's saying is, you should reserve sex for that one person that you have such a passionate love for, that you have such a burning love for, that you're really able to say, I'm not just wanting to have sex with you to fulfill my sexual lust. I am wanting to make love to you to express my personal spiritual love. And that's why this part of marriage should always be enjoyed and expressed and experienced as long as both partners are physically able and either one of those partners desire it. And by the way, that's why I'm very purposeful. That's why I use the word consecrate. You know what the word consecrate means? If you don't, let me give you a real easy example. If you have a rainy day fund, you put aside an amount of money just in case, the car breaks down or you have an unexpected bill to pay, so you got this rainy day fund. That's a consecrated fund. You have set that fund aside and you're not going to let that fund be used for anything except an emergency. Or if you're putting money in retirement, like a 401k, all right, that is a consecrated fund. You're saying, okay, that is not for us to buy clothes, that's not for us to buy a car, that's not for us to even buy a new home, that's for our retirement. It is a consecrated fund. It means to be set aside. Now here's why I say sex consecrate a marriage. Because every time a husband makes love to his wife, or every time the wife makes love to her husband, here's what they're saying. I just want you to know, and this is a reminder, I have set my love aside just for you. That's what the husband says to the wife. And the wife saying to the husband, I just want you to know, I have set my love aside for you. When we got married, this is it. Nobody else, no one else, never, ever, ever. It'll be us, me, you, God, just the three of us. There was a man years ago that wrote a book. And by the way, it's an old book, but I'd encourage you to buy it. If you never bought it or never read it, I'd encourage you to go out and buy it today and read it. It's one of the best books on marriage you will ever read in your life. It was written by a man named William Harley. And the title of the book is the title of my message. I stole his title. His Needs, Her Needs. His Needs, Her Needs. Great read. Let me tell you why it's such a great read. Dr. Harley was a Christian. And he was really bothered by all these marriages that were breaking up, and especially because of affairs, extramarital affairs. And it really bothered him. So he spent 20 years doing research. And the only thing he researched were marriages that fell apart and didn't make it because either one or the other or both were unfaithful to their spouse. So in other words, adultery was the cause of the breakup. He did 20 years studying all of these marriages because he wanted to find out, number one, what's the problem? And number two, how do we fix the problem? So after 20 years of counseling married couples and doing his study, he gathered together what he discovered were the 5 major needs of a woman or a wife and the 5 major needs of a husband. His needs, her needs, okay? I'm not going to give you all 5. You need to go read the book. But I want to give you the number one need, he said, and I'm not trying to stereotype anybody, but basically, the guy's the expert. He said, this is the number one need of the wife. This is the number one need of the husband, all right? The wife's number one need is affection. Now, all you husbands, listen up. When I say that, you say, sure, sex. No, that's not what that means. Okay, that's not what that means. The number one need of a wife is not sex. The number one need of a wife is affection. There's a difference between affection and sex. And what Dr. Harley said was this, kind of what I've already said. Husbands, after you say I do, you still need to continue to show your wife the affection and the attention that you gave her to begin with. What you said to her, what you showed her, What you did for her to win her, you keep doing after you have won her. So what I mean by affection is it may be a hug, it may be a kiss, it may be looking into her eyes and just still telling her, you're the only one for me. It may be bringing her coffee in the morning. It may be doing dishes. It may be taking the garbage out. It may be just spending quality time. Whatever her love language is, that's affection. He says that's the number one need of women. Ladies, the number one need of men is sexual fulfillment. That is the number one need of men, sexual fulfillment. And so what he's saying is, husbands, after you get married, you keep showing her the attention and affection that you showed her before you got married. And wives, after you say I do, you be the one person that your husband knows he can go to have his sexual needs met. Now, close your books, put your pens down, turn off your iPhones, look up here, give me just one more paragraph and we're going to be done, okay? You've been so good, I'm going to let you out early. Feel like a principal, okay? I want to tell you why I'm so passionate about this series and why this is such a big deal to me. I've been so blessed, just unbelievably blessed. If I could go back 42 years and you said to me, you can marry anybody you want to marry, I'd marry her. Every time, I'd marry her. I'm hard pressed to think of ways as a wife that she's not the best wife I could have ever had. I can't think of one. I can't remember what else you told me to say, honey. It's kind of a, So I'm blessed, but I want you to hear me, and hear me clearly. We don't have a perfect marriage, and we've never had a perfect marriage. Now, I can brag about one thing most of you can't brag about. We've never had an argument in 42 years. Never had an argument. Now, we've had discussions you could hear to Stone Mountain. We've never had an argument, okay? Yeah, we've had arguments. We've had our share of arguments, okay? We've had our share of things we've had to work through. We've gone through some rocky times. So I don't want to sit up here and think, it's not Camelot all the time. Trust me. I mean, you look, you hear me enough up here to know that ain't true, right? So I want you to hear that. But I tell you what I have learned, and I've learned it almost every day. I have yet to see a marriage that's not worth saving. I haven't seen one yet. You can help me find one. I have yet to see a marriage that's not worth saving. I know some of you in this room right now, and some of you listening to me right now on computer, TV, whatever, other campus, you've been squirming.